Good afternoon and welcome to 365 Days of Amazing Stories with Theo Mayer. Here we are today, 126, which, believe it or not, is a multiple of 7. Now, you might want to think for a second, how can 126 be a multiple of 7? 7 is such an interesting number when it comes to times tables and multiplication and all that. I don't know why. It's just one of those unique numbers. And for me, even as a teacher, it was one of the most difficult numbers to kind of remember the times table for. Now, how do you get to 126? Think about 70 twice, which is 140, and subtract 14 from that, and you end up 126. So that's a clear sign that that's the case. Or you take 70 and you subtract it from 126 and you're left with 56, and 56 is 7 times 8. So once again, here we are. We're to the 18th week of me doing this, this endeavor of 365 days of amazing stories with Theo Mayer. Wow. It's kind of, it's challenging doing a story every day. All right, so last week, I talked a little bit about bees, and I had just worked some bees and tried to split some hives. The 3 hives that I did split from the 4 hives that I had seemed to be quite, active. Yesterday, I was doing some weed whacking around their hives without a veil on or anything, and they don't like the noise from weed whackers and, grass flying around. And believe me, in a couple of seconds, I had a number of bees that were hot on my trail. I tried to book it into a shady place where they might not see me, but I already had 2 bees on me. I ended up getting stung right in my neck, right the throat chakra. And the other bee didn't get me, but boy, it was sure trying for a while. It's interesting where bees end up stinging you. And, stings from bees can be very therapeutic. So anyway, the bees are doing great here. And we'll see if my splits end up taking. In order for them to take, they either have to have a queen cell in them that will hatch out, or eggs that are no more than 2 days old, which they would then make into a queen cell. So in a couple of weeks, I'm going to go into those hives and see where everything is at with them. And I'm also going to go into my older hives, the hives that I took the bees out from, and make sure that they are still working properly. And it's just like, quite a thing. And I may also try to order some queen bees online to see if I can make that happen. You get a new queen, and then you take some bees out of your hives and you let them create a new hive. So, I'm trying to up my beehive situation here. Making honey is kind of cool. And I feel like where I live, which is, up in the mountains and far away from any kind of industrial agriculture, it's a really great place to create a very pure bee product. Now, I was in Fairfield, Iowa, when I really got into beekeeping, and I was in the whole TM community there, taking deep dive within myself, meditating twice a day in Fairfield's golden domes with, it was typically around 1,500 people, 1,200 to 1,500 people a day meditating at the same time. The experience was quite unique, and it allowed one to transcend quite easily and reach that place of silence within. So anyway, in that community, there was a wonderful man who I've not at this point kept in touch with, Keith Rhodes. And I had been inquiring where I might get some bees. The universe works in funny ways, and the impulses and desires that come through us often lead us into situations that, well, then begin to unfold in amazing ways. I heard about Keith Rhodes. Somebody said, oh, if you want bees, you need to go meet up with Keith. And they told me where Keith lived. And Keith lived very close to the Marshy International University campus. He was only like 3 houses away from one of the entrances into the campus on a little street there. And he was living in a little Iowa-style house that was square and 1 story, 4 rooms. He had a wood stove and he had a basement. And, well, it was after our meditation program that evening, and I was walking toward his place. It was springtime, early springtime, so it was dark by the time I was getting there. And I knocked on the door, and Keith called from inside, "Come in." And I walked into this very warm house. He had the wood stove was going. It was warm, and Keith was splitting or getting the meat out of black walnuts. So he was shelling walnuts, and he had a little wooden thing with holes in it, and he would put a black walnut in there, hit it with a hammer to open it up. Black walnuts are really hard. They're not like the English walnut. And the flavor is very different as well. It's very strong, very wild. So it was really interesting. Keith and I looked like we could be brothers. And he just was immediately inviting. He said, invited me in to sit down next to him. We had never met. And here we are. We're immediately like in this close connection with each other. And he had a pot of soup that was actually on the wood stove cooking away. And he offered me soup. So we sat and had soup and began talking about bees. And he said that, yes, he'd be happy to sell me a beehive, which he did later that spring. And anyway, that evening we really kindled or rekindled friendship. Now, he delivered the hive. I don't remember the whole timing of the thing, but we also began to work together. Both of us had done a lot of construction. Keith way more than me. He grew up as a Mennonite horse and buggy farmer in a community in Pennsylvania. Now, that community, part of it moved to a place in Kentucky, including his mom and dad. They moved to Bowling Green, Kentucky, and with a number of other families, and started a little Mennonite horse and buggy community in Bowling Green, which at a certain point in time, I think it was like not quite a year later, during Thanksgiving, Keith invited me to go visit his family in Bowling Green, and we drove down there, which next week I'll tell the story of going down to that community and what an impact that made on me. But Keith and I began doing construction projects together, and that was quite an amazing thing. He was so used to working with his hands because of how he had grown up. And he had a great wisdom in how to use not only his body, but tools. Now, one example of this was we were digging a hole, and I was on the task of digging the hole. It had a diameter of about 4 feet, and we were going to be going down, I don't know how far, maybe like 5 feet deep. And I'm kind of randomly digging and shoveling dirt out of this hole, and Keith stands and watches, and I'm not having the easiest time of it. And I look at him and I go, like, what? And he says, well, there's an easier way to do that. And I'm like, okay, tell me, what is that? And he said, I'll show you. And he hops down in the hole, I hop out, and he begins to dig that hole in a spiral. So he's digging around, and as he's digging around, it's really easy to move the dirt out of the way. So kind of randomly going at it. The progress had to have been at least twice as fast, maybe 3 times as fast. There's wisdom. And unfortunately, I think we're losing a lot of the wisdom of how to do things because we do everything with machines these days. Beekeeping. So Keith had probably 100 beehives out across the Iowa landscape. And I began to help him out with beekeeping. I would go out there when we would harvest honey. I'd go out there when we were checking hives. Keith would work the hives with just a little veil over his head that bees could actually even get in under the veil if they wanted to. He was barehanded when he worked them. I could never do that. It's like I just seemed to always invite bees to sting me. And so I always wore gloves and, really had a good veil on and clothing so that the bees couldn't get in. But just to see somebody work with such ease around bees was an inspiration. We always used a smoker whenever we were working the bees, which puts the bees into a state of feeling like they need to be tending to the upcoming fire event, which the smoke tells them, okay, a fire's coming. When bees feel like a fire's coming, their response is to begin to gorge themselves on honey, because they will then, as a group, travel away from the smoke and find a new place to build a hive. So they get preoccupied with the possibility of a fire. So when we would harvest honey, it was back in a day when beekeeping was a little easier because the mites that we have these days are very hard on the bee population. And I can't even remember where they came from, somewhere across the oceans. So before that, beekeeping was pretty easy. You didn't even really have to treat them for anything. You just make sure that, they had plenty of bee reserve through the winter in order to make it. And the bees during the winter will make a cluster, a ball around the queen, and they'll migrate from inside next to the queen to outside, keeping the interior warm and, allowing everybody to kind of migrate from one section of the ball to another. Now, when we would harvest honey, we would pull off these supers, as they were called, where all the frames of the honey were. These tended to be about 8 inches high, maybe a little bit less, 7.5, 8 inches high. And we would pull these supers off and load them into Keith's pickup truck. And we would take those into his, into town where his house was. We load them into the basement, and there he had his extractor, which would spin the frames. Once we'd uncapped the frames, it would spin it and spin the honey out. I can see I'm only going to get a little bit into this beekeeping thing today. Anyway, we would load the pickup truck full of these honey supers. We might have 30 honey supers inside the truck. And often the honey supers would still have bees in them. And so the bees would gorge themselves on the honey, and then they would try to leave. Now, every time we would stop at a stop sign or a stoplight, all these bees would fly up from the honey supers. And then the minute we would start driving again, they would fly back down into the supers. So you can imagine what it was like for people that were around us to see this event take place when we were driving with the harvested honey back to Keith's. I feel like I'm going to have to stop our little dissertation here about bees, and I'll continue where I left off next week of arriving at Keith's with a pickup truck full of bees. Okay, I hope you enjoyed. Bees are a great thing to keep. Have a good rest of your day.